I was a big fan of Yu-Gi-Oh growing up. I used to wake up at 6 a.m. every day so I could catch the episodes before school. I remember the first time I saw the Dungeon Dice Monsters episodes, and I thought it was such a cool concept. We used to collect all the cards and battle with the other kids in the street, but we were never able to play Dungeon Dice Monsters because there was no official game. I remember my brother Keith and I created our own version of Dungeon Dice Monsters by cutting up cereal boxes to make the dice and using pieces of paper to create skills and traps for the monster cards we owned. This was the closest I think we ever got to playing the game. There was a game released for the Game Boy Advance, but our local shop never had it in stock, so we were left with just the creation that we had made ourselves. Even to this day, if they released an official Dice Monsters game, I'd buy it day one. I originally started the development for this game in Unity. I was only learning Unreal Engine at the time, so I didn't think I could build a game of this scale in an engine I barely used. I created a basic dice in Maya that could unfold and imported it into Unity. I created some tiles and placed them together to imitate a board and placed colliders around the scene so that dice could not be placed outside the boundary. During this time, I was also working on some smaller projects on Unreal, and the Dice Monsters game got benched for a little while. Once I finished the other projects, which you can see on our channel by the way, I was feeling a little more confident with Unreal, so I tried to emulate in Unreal Engine what I had created in Unity. I started out by bringing the same dice and board piece into Unreal and setting up some overlap events so that the dice would turn red if outside of the boundaries of the board. This all worked great at the beginning, but somewhere along the development this stopped working and I couldn't figure out why, but at least I have some video evidence that shows it was working at some stage. The next thing I wanted to work on was the dice. I had no idea how to animate a dice throw in Unreal, so I figured it might be easier to create a random number generator and link this to the images for the dice. It's a bit of a cheat, but it was fine in this case. I know there's a Dungeon Dice Monsters board game, and the dice and tiles have their own style, but for this game I wanted to try and emulate the show as much as I could. So I used GIMP to paint over some UVs with the random patterns and tried to match the style from the show. I then brought this into Maya and applied the texture I created to the dice. I was happy with how it was turned out. For this project I only created this one style, but I would create a few more if this was for a full game. I then created a card template that I could use for the different monsters. I could have probably done this more efficiently, but I created a widget for each monster, which in turn would spawn the corresponding monster on the card. I only ended up using 5 monsters for this demo, so it would have been very cumbersome to add hundreds more. I would probably implement this differently if I was to do it again. Once I had the spawning working with cubes and spheres, I downloaded some models from the Models Resource website. I imported them into Unreal and set their attributes so that they fit with the scene. I initially started with the Dark Magician and Toon Mermaid, as I knew that if I managed to get the functionality working for just these 2 characters, it was just a matter of importing any other monsters I wanted to use. The next thing I began working on were the crests for the dice. I took some images for the crests from the show and traced over them in GIMP so I could match the style I was after. In the actual game, there are 4 different colours which represent different levels of monster that can be summoned. However, for the purposes of this demo, I just used one dice colour that had no levels. I then linked each of the dice images to a number from the random dice number generator I created earlier, so that if a particular number was chosen, the corresponding crest type would appear. I then set it so that you could only summon a monster if you managed to roll 2 summon crests from the generator, as that's how it works in the game. I then created a crest pool so that when a particular crest is rolled, it'll be added to the crest pool. This was to keep track of how many crests a player had during their turn. Once the crest pool was working, I gave the monsters some input so that they could move around the board. They should only be allowed to move equal to the amount of movement crests available to the player. So I linked the movement and the crests and reduced the movement crests by 1 whenever the player moved one of the monsters on the board. I then began implementing some of the functionality for the second player. I knew adding actual co-op would have been too large a task to do for this demo, so instead I simply allowed the player to control both sides in order to give the effect that 2 players were playing. So I opened GIMP once again and started tracing over the blue dice and adding a pattern similar to how I did it before. Once I had this imported, I created a variable that would track whose turn it was and change the material of the dice depending on that. This gave the illusion that two players were playing. The scene was starting to come together, but the monsters felt a little bit stiff, so I decided to give them some very basic animation. I opened Maya and rigged the models using the auto rig functionality. I then started moving the bones into place so that I could imitate a very simple idle animation. I tested that these animations worked correctly when spawned, and once I was happy with it, I did the same thing for the Toon Mermaid monster. I would have loved to invest some time making the animations look great, but given my animation skills, I'd wagered that they'd look no better than they do now, no matter how much time I spent on them. After this, I spent a good bit of time importing different monsters and setting them up as I have for the others. This involved downloading their models and creating their card images. I was originally creating all the card images in Unreal to try and have dynamic elements that I could change on the fly, but after some time I realized that I wasn't actually interacting with any of the elements from the card, so I decided to make them static images instead. I used the card template from before and created the cards for the remaining monsters I wanted to add to the scene. I added the Winged Karibo, Summoned Skull and Parrot Dragon, as these are all the models that were easily available online that had no geometry issues. Given the time I was spending setting up these monsters, I decided that 5 of them was enough. I was originally going to have each player have 5 monsters each, but this would have added another couple of days to the project, so I decided that each player would use the same monsters. Once I had set up all the monsters, I placed them in the scene to make sure they looked okay and worked well with each other. I then began working on some of the props. As I said earlier, I wanted to try and make this look like the game from the show, so I enclosed the board around some static meshes and positioned the camera so that you could get a good view of everything in the scene. I then created some podiums for each of the players to indicate their positions and assigned hard points that act as the life points in the show. Once I was finished setting up the scene, it was just a matter of playing the game a number of times to make sure that all dice positions were correct and that the player spawned in the correct spot. I also used this time to note down any quality of life improvements I could make so that I could add them in closer to the end of development. And you'll get a brief glimpse into one of the crashes I got here. This is one of many crashes I had during the development of this game. The last main thing to do was to add some basic attack animations to the monsters so that the monsters could destroy each other once within range. I gave an attack animation to each of the monsters and added some functionality so that the attacks could only be performed when within range and if enough attack crests were in the player's crest pool. I also added some functionality so that the monsters could only walk when on a dice piece so that they couldn't move all around the board. The final thing I did was to add some functionality to the heart points so that if a monster was within range, the heart points could then be attacked. Each attack would stop a heart from glowing, and if all the heart pieces were destroyed, the game would end. For the end game, I created a very basic UI that just had an image and a button that would say play again, so that once the game was over, the player could choose to play the game again should they want. I also just added some text above this that said game over to indicate that the game was finished. I also used the time dilation function in order to set the timescale to 0 to prevent players from performing any additional actions once the game was finished. And that was it for the development. I added in some particle effects to the attacks and played around with some of the post-processing in the scene. I tried to give it a purple overtone to make it seem like you're in the Shadow Realm or something like that, because that's just been an ongoing joke between my brother and I for years. I honestly could have worked on this for so much longer. I was really liking the development. However, with projects like this, I don't like spending too much time on them because I don't own the IP, so you run the risk of putting too much work into an IP that you don't own. So at the beginning of the development for this, I only wanted to achieve what a modern day Dungeon Dice Monsters game would look like, and I think I did that. It's missing a lot of the functionality, such as like magic and trap crest functions. For now, the player only has the ability to defend and attack, and some of the controls are very clunky. Like for example, like the monsters only look in one direction, so if you rotate a dice, the monster is looking the wrong way if you try and move them to another piece. But for these projects, I always try and give myself a 2 to 3 week timeline to finish them. I work full time, so I spend about 2 hours a night working on these remakes to try avoid burning out. I'm happy with how it turned out. There's so much more I would have loved to add, but who knows, maybe if this video gets enough traction, it will get the wheels turning for an official remake. Thanks for making it this far into the video. Like and subscribe for more weird projects like this. Keith recently remade the South Park game for the PS1 in the style of the Stick of Truth, so why not check that out, as well as some of our other projects, and we'll see you in the next one. Enjoy some of the footage from the game, and thanks for watching.